You're listening to the Unlocking Africa podcast.
There's a certain tenacity, there's a certain discipline, certain dedication, in some way discernment too, that it takes. I come from a family that are full of farmers, from great-grandparents to grandparents to parents. My father still farms to this day. You don't just come in and say, I spent 1 year, and you expect heaven and earth to split open and pave a way for you. Agriculture is just not one of those industries. It's not something you can just shortcut. The goal is also getting our local communities involved in an organized way, right?
Stay tuned as we bring you inspiring people who are unlocking Africa's economic potential. You're listening to the Unlocking Africa podcast with your host, Tessa Adamu.
Welcome to the Unlocking Africa podcast, where we find brilliant people who are doing brilliant things to unlock Africa's economic potential. Today, we have a special guest. We have Shalom Bako, who is the managing director of Afrivana. Welcome to the podcast, Shalom. How are you?
Doing great. How about yourself?
I'm good, thank you. Good to see you, and I've been looking forward to our conversation. So happy it's finally here.
Yeah, same here.
Purposely, I've kept my intro very short, so please feel free to introduce yourself. Tell us a bit more about Shalom.
Okay, I'm Shalom Bako. I'm born and raised in northern Nigeria. That's where I spent most of my life. At some point, I had the privilege and opportunity to go out to the States, go to school, play sports out there. But through and through, born and raised Nigerian, and today I love what I do. Passionate about football, passionate about agriculture, and just trading in Africa.
So you mentioned that you were raised in the United States and you played football. I think you're being pretty modest. I think you're being pretty modest. You played football at quite a high level. You played for the LA Galaxy. So how was that experience of playing football at such a high level?
Well, like I said, born and raised in Nigeria, and then later on, closer to my college years, went to the U.S. And as far as football goes, and we'll get more into it, right? But it's really about a mentality. I think once you get to a certain stage, everybody has the skills it takes to play, but it had to do with a mentality, and that will kind of roll into where we are today in terms of Afrivana in this business. But really had to do with a mentality. That was one of the things I learned being an immigrant to the U.S. and playing football in the States. I played on multiple teams, one of which was the LA Galaxy. And those experiences taught me a lot of things that I translate into what I do today and into business and how I approach these things. And a huge part of that is just the mentality. You can have the skills, but it takes more than just the skills to be a professional.
Okay, fantastic. So you mentioned a couple of times there in terms of the mentality. So do you think competitiveness and dedication required to play football at such a high level prepared you for the competitive world of international business?
Absolutely. I believe that the mentality and a lot of principles you can learn in professional sports in general prepares you a lot for business. There's a certain tenacity, there's a certain discipline, certain dedication, and in some way discernment too that it takes. So I always use football analogies, even in my day-to-day business world.
Okay.
Because it really does apply, no matter how you cut it. But yes, there is a certain tenacity it takes. Business is not a one-day thing or a one-year thing. Just like with football and just like with most sports, you might lose games.
Yes.
Right? Every day is not a winning day. So you're in Liverpool, right? If Liverpool they haven't won every single game. Even in the seasons where they won the championship, there were games that they lost. And so I choose to approach it this way because there is that tenacity, the tenacity to keep going when you're down, right? Yes. When you're up, 3-0, it's easy to keep going. But when you're down, 2 points, 3 points, 4 points, and you have to come back from it, there's a certain mentality you have to have. And not everybody has it, frankly. So I do believe in the tenacity and a lot of principles that I've gotten from professional sports that I apply to business.
I agree. I mean, a lot of times in business and in sports, it's about being consistent and understanding the challenges, preparing yourself, and not giving up. So, no, definitely, I understand where you're coming from with this. So, you're currently specializing in agriculture and farming. Prior to that, football was a huge part of your life. So,
Yeah.
I'm just going to go straight into it. How did you go from being a footballer to a farmer? Was it always part of your long-term plan, or was this something that you just fell into?
Um, well, it wasn't part of my long-term plan. Football or farming, actually. I didn't really,
Interesting.
I didn't really like get into football with the intention of, I'm going to be a professional football player, and neither farming. So these are both things that were always part of my childhood. Growing up in northern Nigeria, football was just something we do almost every day, after school or during your breaks. I went to boarding school most of my life.
Yes.
So after classes are over and you've done all your homework and all these type of things, there's a physical activity time. And so most of the time, a lot of what we would do, soccer and football is the preferred sport. So it was always part of my childhood. And this was a hobby that I always enjoyed. Probably not as much as my father. He was more of the football enthusiast. So I would just tag along, or in boarding school, all the boys play. It's just always been a part of my life. Farming as well. I come from a family that are full of farmers, from great-grandparents to grandparents to parents.
Yes.
My father still farms to this day. So these are things that we just grew up with. And if you know about northern Nigeria, obviously,
Yes.
agriculture and farming is just a part of our livelihood. It's in our blood. These were just two things that were always been a part of my life. I didn't initially intend on just going towards both of those. I think those just kind of naturally came out because that's part of just who I am. I think those have just kind of over the years naturally been exuded through the things I do. And, grown through business, tried other businesses, and coming back to football and farming, it feels like a natural lane and a spot for me.
Yes.
And so that's pretty much how I ended up back here to football and farming. So, yeah.
Oh, it's an extremely interesting journey. I mean, you mentioned growing up as a child, farming was a part of your life.
Right.
You know yourself, the perception of farming amongst young people in Africa. I mean, it's gradually changing, but I guess when you started your agriculture journey, amongst definitely young people in Africa, farming is seen as something that is probably too much hard work for little return, or a job for sometimes poor people. What did you see in African agriculture that other people were missing?
That's a good question. I don't know that it's what most people are missing, right? As you mentioned, agriculture is not one of those industries that has a sex appeal to it.
Yes. It doesn't.
It doesn't really have that, I want to go get. And because it doesn't have that real appeal, whether in terms of people don't really get to see the financial side of it, right? Or people eat food every day, right?
Yeah.
Now, that could be enough of something to just sit back and think, how many people on this planet, they need to eat every day. So that's essential. But looking at it from a business perspective, not a lot of people. Now, you already mentioned something in terms of the labor.
Yes.
Agriculture is a labor of love. It takes time for it to grow. And we just don't live in a day and age where people really want to take time. There's a lot of fast gratification, and it's, how can I make money online? How can I do the least and get the most? Agriculture is just not one of those industries. It's not something you can just shortcut. So because of the labor and time it takes, and then the outcome or the results of it, even the financial results of it, it's not always marketed as it is with the tech industry.
Yeah.
Or with some of these other industries. And so it doesn't seem as attractive. And you're right, it is labor intensive. If you are actively a farmer and you have to go into the farm and go into the land, it's physically draining, right? It's physical labor. Now, that's one of the benefits of, I guess, being an athlete, right? You don't mind the physical labor, and in some cases you really enjoy that. And so it's not as attractive to people for those reasons. But for me, what I saw was a number of things. I'm in agriculture for a number of reasons. As I've mentioned, my upbringing and where I'm born and raised has a huge part to do with it. After going to the diaspora, you're playing professional sports, and you know how it is when you move from Africa or you're African in the diaspora, people look at you a lot different back home. For me, going back, when I started to go back, even after I moved, there was a point in time where I knew I was moving back to the continent, not to stay in the States forever. So when I started going back, I realized and saw the same things we were dealing with when I was a kid, and the conditions as to how things were still the same, right?
Yeah.
Even after 10 years. That made me sad because, I've grown up in these places and you want to see things change. And so when you think about the insecurity, especially in Northeast Nigeria, where I'm from, that was also a factor. And for me, agriculture is a result in terms of that's a solution. I see it as more of a solution. Just going back often and seeing the conditions of things, this was kind of what was laid on my heart. I already understand the terrain. I understand what most of the community are involved with and what you can actually make an impact with. And agriculture is that. That's how and where I could make the biggest impact. I could go play professional sports anywhere in the world, right?
Yeah.
But what impact is that going to have really to Bauchi or Gombe or Yobe or Borno? I can build a marketing agent. What impact is it going to have locally? And at the end of the day, that's what, for me, that I saw. Not necessarily the finance, because again, it's a labor of love. Agriculture is not something you turn around and get huge returns immediately. You have to put in that time. So I understood that. And I was just willing to put in the time. Still am. So that's more of what I see that I feel like others potentially don't see. And my exposure going to the States allowed me to see that there's huge demand for our agricultural goods. And on the global scale, we don't really participate in distributing it.
Yes.
We only take part in the production, but we don't take part in the distribution of it. And I know what the market and distribution of some of our agricultural goods are in the States. I know how much is bought in the markets. And most of those markets, most of them are definitely not being distributed by people in our community. And so I saw that disconnect, and I was just able to connect my experience in the US with my upbringing being from northern Nigeria. And that's really what it was for me.
Fantastic. You've mentioned it was a labor of love, and you were going back to Nigeria and seeing the conditions there and how things hadn't moved on. Was there a point where you were involved in agriculture, but you weren't based in Nigeria and you were having to manage your farms from the US?
Well, it's been a very, there's been stages. We're talking about over a decade's, right, worth of process. So there were stages where I wasn't getting into farming. A lot of it was, especially in the beginning, was really trying to understand the value chain.
Yes.
Now, I already know where the farms are and the production is done, right? So it was really trying to learn the other parts of the value chain, and then where the lowest barriers to entry is, where I could actively play a role. So there was a point in time where I was in the diaspora more, trying to figure it out. And being in the diaspora, it's not possible for me to physically be at the farm, right? And so I used a different strategy at that time into getting into that stage. So I've played a different role in the value chain at different stages at different years. And that role was more of, marketing, sales, things that I have more strengths in while in the diaspora. And then while on the continent, obviously being on the ground, it's easier to go to the farms. It's easier to check in and have meetings with farmers or communities of farmers. And so it's looked different at different stages. We don't do all our own farming. The goal is commercial scale farming,
Yes.
right? The goal is also getting our local communities involved in an organized way, because I can't possibly farm everything that's needed for the global market. And that's not really the goal.
No.
So it's been a process of, yeah, we have our own farms and we do what we can with that. And sometimes even use that as a model or as like the testing ground for certain things. And then we see how we scale it to other farmers, to other communities. And so, yeah, it's looked different at different stages. Now, been able to pull together more of a team and different people that manage different aspects of it.
You mentioned about being in the diaspora, and your process of moving back to Nigeria was done in, say, phases or stages. I know there are a lot of people from the African diaspora who listen to this podcast, and I can imagine that they're probably wanting to know the steps that you went through to move back.
Mm-hmm.
What advice would you give people who are interested in moving back to Nigeria or Africa?
Well, like you said, right now there's a lot more interest than I've ever seen in the last 10 years in terms of people that want to connect back with the continent. The first piece of advice is, like you said, it's a process. I think that's one of the first things I will say to anybody. And it really depends as well how long you've been detached, if you will. Whether it's 2 years or 10 years or 20 years, it's going to be a process. And it also depends on your intentions in going back, right? If your intentions in going back is strictly for business, I mean, there's a lot of layers to it. But the number one thing for me that I want to relay is it's going to be a process. And you have to be real about that process. There are people who have jumped ship and immediately gone and stuck to it. There's people that have gone and moved back, right?
Yes.
That could also be part of the process. It was a process for me. Okay, I knew what I was going in for the first time. I started right after university, still being in the professional soccer space or professional football space, and making that decision that I was going to go back. It wasn't received in the best place. Like,
Why?
Why exactly? Why on earth would you do that? But mentally, I already knew who I was. I was already 10 years down the line. Mentally, there was no way you could cut it. I was back home, done. And so, but I understood that it would take a process. So the process at first was going in a bit, knowing that, okay, I have to come back. I would go for a certain amount of time in the beginning with specific intentions. And I had already planned it before. I had already saved up some money. I had already known what business I wanted to get into. I had a partner that was on ground, so that helped. And before I even took that trip back the first time, it was already a year process before in terms of preparation. So it almost looked like I woke up overnight, but I had been preparing prior to it. And I went in for a short period of time and came out. And that was a harsh awakening, let me tell you. That was a rude awakening. And I kind of came back just drained and disappointed in myself. And so kind of mustered and learned from those experiences and said, okay, let me go back in, spend more time and understood things a lot better, did a lot more research on the industries I wanted to get into specifically and all those things. So I started that gradual process, and over 10 years later, it's not perfect in some ways. I still travel a lot, but I'm a lot more grounded and a lot more rooted in what I do on the continent, on ground. So it's going to be a process. It could be a long process. It just depends on what your time commitment and financial commitment and understanding exactly what you're going to do there. Sometimes you might not know, and maybe it's a exploration process.
Yeah.
But you just have to be real about that. The thing I will say about diasporans and going back is this: whether you spent 2 years and you're gone, or you've spent 10 or 20, you're coming in with a different mentality. And sometimes you're coming in trying to bulldoze your way into systems and a society that has to take time. A lot of diasporans are just not realistic about it, right? You don't just come in and say, I spent 1 year, and you expect heaven and earth to split open and pave a way for you. No, it's going to take grinding. It's going to take grit. And this is where the entrepreneurial or business side comes in. You also have a lot of people in diaspora that, okay, you want to go back and do business, which is a lot of people's goals, but are you already doing business? Or is this going to be a process of I'm learning how to do business on top of adjusting back to a society or adjusting to a new society? And so there's a lot of layers to it, like I said, and everyone's different, you know? So one person's journey is not going to look like yours. Mine is not going to look like someone else's, but certain things are going to be consistent. And one of those is make sure you're realistic about the timeline and the time and the commitment, the dedication it takes to make that a reality. It's not going to be easy. And I think coming from a lot of, especially in the diaspora, coming from a lot of Western societies that may have a lot more infrastructure that makes it easier to kind of get into the flow of things, we know that that's not the reality in most African countries. And so that comfort that they're looking for, you have to be prepared to throw all that out the window, roll your sleeves up, and start creating what it is that you want to see, rather than coming in expecting for those things to be already laid out. No, for those people that are interested, going back means you're going to create those things that you're talking about, those things that you enjoy in the West. Or that's what you're going to create. It's not you're going to find something created. I think that's a huge problem we have, but not a lot of people are ready or willing to commit the time and resources it takes to make those things a reality.
Yeah. So, I mean, you've spoke quite a bit in terms of the transitional period. It takes time. You also mentioned you have to be quite intentional or purposeful in terms of what it is you plan to do once you get there, whether you're going on a fact-finding mission or whether you're going to find opportunities. So I guess you went out there knowing that you wanted to get into agriculture. You went there to look for opportunities. So I'm assuming you found some opportunities whilst you were in that transitional period. So if we can touch upon that in terms of how big are the agriculture opportunities in Africa at the moment? Or I guess, how have you seen it develop since your time of transitioning, moving from the US back to Nigeria?
Yeah, so it's really clear. I didn't go in with the intention knowing initially that agriculture is what I'm going to do.
Okay.
I think similar to a lot of people at that time, it's like I said, it's just always been a natural part of my family. So it's always been there, but I didn't really see it as initially the opportunity where I'm going to get into this business.
Okay, so what changed your mind?
So my goal and intention going in was really simple. I just wanted to build a marketing and distribution business. Simple. Now, that can be applied to multiple industries. I just wanted to market and distribute both on the continent and off the continent, products, resources, that sort of thing. So that's still been the same goal, really, even with agriculture. It has been that marketing and distribution. Now there's more layers now. It's not just the market and distribution, but also manufacturing. That's the future of where we're going. So I didn't initially look at agribusiness as that. What changed my mind, like I said, when I started going back home quite frequently and often spending much longer periods of time, and also hearing all the news in the diaspora and the perspectives from that. And, you know, in northern Nigeria, you consistently hear about, you know, kidnappings, killings, insecurity. And these are the things that are just marketed. But for me, knowing where I'm born and raised, there's a lot of beautiful parts of where I'm from that's just not being told or shared. And there's a lot more that I could do. I start going back and trying to figure out what it is that I could do right there in that community. And so even with agriculture, I remember as a young kid, right, in the village in Bochi. We would farm corn. Everybody farms corn. And we'd take that corn. And at one point, my father bought this little grinding machine. And some people know it is. There's this blue grinding machine that we grew up with that you see. And so you pour the corn or you pour the beans, or it just grinds it, right, and comes out. And that was really the first manufacturing, if you will, or processing plant I had ever seen. And it's still there today. And so once I started getting to that, I started seeing that in northern Nigeria, in Gombe, for example, I would see trailers, not just Gombe, everywhere I would see trailers of raw materials leaving the state. So with corn, for example, you see trailers of corn leaving. I would also see that a lot of family members and friends and people have poultries, and they feed these chickens the flour. Now, I discovered that the corn would leave, get turned into flour, and brought back to be sold. That's on a small scale. That's on a local scale. On a global scale, I would also see that in the diaspora, things that are sourced from us and processed into products that we then buy again locally. And so those were some of the things that just kind of sparked me to start thinking, hey, everybody has to eat, So I started digging more into the international trade side of things and seeing what are the raw agricultural products that get sold out the country. A big one was hibiscus. So being in the States at the time, I was just getting off not getting off, but I was still kind of in the professional football space. And there was a time I tasted this drink from a Mexican restaurant.
Okay.
It just brought back a ton of memories. It just brought back like my entire childhood flashed before my eyes because it tasted familiar. And this was something that we'd farm the corn, right? But around it, as a fence, we'd farm hibiscus. And my grandmother would still use that hibiscus flower to make a drink, the leaves to make soup, right? And once I had that experience where I tasted this drink at a Mexican shop, I was like, how did you make it? And they showed me how they make it. Now, this is a drink that we call zobo.
Yes.
And they call Jamaica.
Interesting.
So I started just doing some research around that and discovered that these flowers are actually brought from Nigeria and exported here. And these people buy it in local shops and make it the same way we do and drink. And so that started triggering my mind around agribusiness and international trade. I started discovering, okay, what can I market and distribute from the continent to other parts of the world?
Brilliant. I mean, you mentioned in terms of you saw potential opportunities whilst in the States, and obviously within Africa there's an abundance of land which then presents these agricultural opportunities in terms of to sell locally or internationally. So through that you do see people try their hand at agriculture, but not many people unfortunately manage to, I guess, succeed or scale their agriculture operations, because agriculture isn't art form, it is a science. You've managed to find a way to perfect it and scale your operation. So what I would like to know is, what would you advise people in terms of how can they or how should they educate themselves to increase their chances of success in African agriculture?
Yeah, well, I'm still learning. Just so you know,
it's a journey.
It's a journey. I don't feel like I've perfected it. I think that I've made mistakes and I learn from those and keep going. That persistence is necessary. I realized one of those things that has helped me is, again, the mentality, understanding that it is a journey. One, it's not going to happen overnight. And being willing to go through the process. It is challenging. There's no easy way. There's no way around it, really. So you have to be willing to go through the challenges.
Yes, I agree.
That's something that mentally I already prepared myself since 2010. I knew that it would be a journey. And I did set out for myself, look, this is where I'm going to focus the next 10 years. I'm going to figure it out. I'm not going to get it right all at once or the first time. But mentally, I was already prepared to give it a decade. Just like sports, right? Going back to football. like I said, you don't win every game, right? You could be down in the first half and you still have an opportunity in the second half. I still approach business like I do sports. Everything is not relying on just this one game. I'm looking at the entire season, right? That type of mentality is, I believe, essential to the success, right?
Okay.
And then the willingness to, in essence, lose the ball, right? To risk it, to take the chances, to put money when money needs to be put, to put time when time needs to be put, to make certain sacrifices when those need to be made, to pivot when you need to get the right partners, the right team,
Yes.
going outside of just family. Because we have that notoriously in the diaspora. Oh, well, I know this person will do it for me. This is my family member.
Yes.
This is my friend.
Yeah, well, what does he know about agriculture?
Thank you. The willingness to get experts,
Yes.
right? And pay them for their time or have them compensated for what, that type of thing, approaching it from a business perspective. And like I said, I very much approach business like professional football, whereby I look at it as you have 11 players on the field, but you also have players that are on the bench.
Yes.
You also have trainers. You also have equipment managers. You also have those people that are off the field, in the locker rooms, or in the equipment rooms, or in the media rooms. So I still look at it that way. And if it's 11 players on the field, there's strikers, there's midfielders, there's defenders, there's goalkeeper. Everybody plays a role. And for me, it was finding my role and then finding those right teammates that you feel like you can win games and championships and seasons with. If you want to go fast, go alone. If you want to go far, go together.
Fantastic. I love that saying. I think you've touched upon the importance of having a team and knowing your role in the team. You've also touched upon you made mistakes and learned from those mistakes. One thing that we do hear quite a lot about is that, in sub-Saharan Africa, there is extreme post-harvest losses in agriculture. I think estimated at around $4 billion annually. In terms of you mentioned or touched upon making mistakes, is this something that you've kind of experienced, or what systems have you put in place? What processes do you have in place to reduce post-harvest loss? Can you tell us a bit about that?
Oh, yeah. I mean, it is a problem for many reasons. And in my experience, I'll give you one. Sesame seed was the first post-harvest loss I had. Okay. And it hurt because you planned it a year ahead and get excited. And the reason for that loss was just that the harvest wasn't done in time.
Okay.
Right. And so certain forces came together, rain and other things, and it just kind of destroyed most of it. So there are quite a number of factors to post-harvest loss. I think one of the big factors that I've seen, and some of them, especially when you talk about fruits or vegetables, has been storage, packaging. These are things that I harp on and we take seriously when it comes to our stuff, is storage and packaging. If you don't store it right, if you don't package it right, these losses are going to be inevitable.
Yes.
The other thing is diversifying what we can do with these things. Again, most of what we have and most of these losses that happen, post-harvest losses, most of them always happen in its raw form. So let's use tomatoes or mangoes as an example. You'll have trailers of tomatoes, right? Maybe leaving from Jos to Lagos. And what's going to happen by the time they get there? They're just dumped in a huge truck, not packaged properly, lumped on each other. They're going to squish and get destroyed and all these things. And then you get there and you wonder, why are some already rotten? Why is there so many destroyed? Why is there this? And it's something that is going to continue on a daily basis deteriorating because it's not stored properly. It's not packaged properly. There's a lot of other things you can do to prevent those post losses, right? And that's why I was talking about processing and manufacturing and looking more at that as the future of agribusiness in Africa. So if you have more local processing ability, then instead of just sending raw tomatoes, it can be aggregated a lot more locally, perhaps even just packaged better. Even if processing doesn't have to just be, I'm going to make it into tomato sauce or paste, right? Which is also an option, which is something we can do, or preserve it better. But even in packaging, what if we, instead of just dumping them all into one sack, you can package them into smaller cases and a better way to help the logistics process, or help the consumer be able to get it easier or in a smaller chunk. There's a lot of things. So I think there's a lot of ways we can improve the post-harvest loss situations. Like I said, some of it is in processing, in storage, in just also understanding the diversity of what you can use some of these things for.
Fantastic, thank you. So obviously you've touched upon processing, storage, manufacturing, and logistic movements to reduce post-harvest loss. So I'm assuming that you have to be fairly, integrated in your value chain and supply chain. I mean, is this something that you have done in terms of to fully integrate yourself into your value chain and supply chain to reduce post-harvest loss? And if you can tell us a bit more in terms of how you've done that.
Yeah, well, we are working on integrating a lot of the value chain. And that's why I said the process is taking years and different points in the value chain. Currently, the agricultural products that we focus on, again, it's back to that processing and packaging thing. That's one of the big ways that we focused on, is how are we processing this post-harvest, right? How are we storing this post-harvest to ensure the shelf life, or, the product life of this. And so it's stuff that we practice, whether with ginger or with hibiscus, any other thing. And I will say that we have a bias on certain, you'll observe that with the products that we do focus on, there's certain type of product, meaning they have a diversity, right? We can either choose to process and store them as dried goods, or as powdered goods, or be able to process them into oils, So we try to look at all of these angles, and make sure that, again, storage, packaging, I think these are, and how you process it initially will have a huge role to play in some of these. So that's kind of how we've been able to do it so far. And we'll continue to, I guess, as we diversify the products, we don't do a huge portfolio of stuff. So we just kind of focus on specific ones and be really, really good at it. And then maybe we start introducing others.
Fantastic. I'm assuming because you stay quite close to your value chain and supply chain that you're probably exposed to many opportunities in African agriculture. What are some of the untapped opportunities in African agriculture that people might not be aware of?
Cannabis.
Interesting.
One of the privileges of being able to go into the diaspora and take the experience there and also connect it to, or bringing it back to the continent. I'm just sharing one. By the way, agriculture is one industry. There's a ton of opportunities. And that's why I'm a Africa ambassador. I mean, there's a ton of opportunities beyond just agriculture. And I will say that this is one of the challenges I've seen us have, is if we hear about any industry that anybody has made money in recently,
we all move to it.
Everybody rushes to it.
Yes.
I share transparently, and I think you've seen a lot of my content, is I do that because, to me, there's an unlimited amount of opportunities. So it doesn't hurt me to share, hey, I do hibiscus, I do ginger. You want to bum rush it and get into it? Sure. But I know how much time I've spent and invested to do this and get to this point. So there's a lot of opportunities. In agribusiness, there's opportunities not just in farming, and that's why it's important to understand the value chain. Yes, there's the production, but there's also a lot of things in between, from the processing, from the logistics, right? There's the producer, but then there's in between as well to the distribution, all the way to the consumer or the retail. There's so many points in the value chain. And again, goes back to this team mentality. We have to think as a team. All right, what role do you play as someone in the diaspora? What role do you play as someone who may have access to processing equipment or capital or land? So there's a lot of opportunity in agribusiness that goes beyond just the production. But if you're asking me specifically as far as the crop, cannabis, I think that's one of the untapped opportunities on the continent. And I say that because I've seen how in the States, for example.
Yes, well, I mean, you live in LA, so you probably can see firsthand.
Right. So coming back and forth to California and seeing firsthand what that process was over the years, seeing the regulations, seeing the way it's regulated and used and processed in different forms. And to also understand that, obviously as Africans, we come from this cultural mentality of, marijuana, we already have our stigma on it.
Yes.
Right. But understanding that there's a lot more you can do with it. Just like I talk about hibiscus, right? It's not just the flower. Yeah, the drink is one thing. What about its coloring benefits? There's different industries that use it. It's not just the drink. Yeah, the drink is one part. What about the powder? What about the oil, right? Yes. It's used in health and beauty. It's used in the fashion industry, right? It's used in so many ways. So that's why I harp on that research. We can research more around what else can you do with corn?
Yeah.
Right? So that we can start preventing post-harvest loss. What else can we process these things into? And so with something like cannabis, it has many uses. It has a growing global demand, right? And it's really no different than growing hibiscus. But there's a lot of things you can do. Hemp, construction. There's what you call hempcrete. You can literally build homes and houses, right? Yes. There's a lot of uses. Just like we use the hibiscus plant, we use the flower, but we also use the leaves, right? You can also use the stem. You can also use the seeds. It's knowing how to use these things rather than just thinking about it as,
yes,
there's something that somebody smokes. Look, there's a lot of uses for this stuff. So that's what it is for me. But in terms of specific cannabis, I think there's a lot of untapped opportunities in cannabis that have big potential, but there's a ton of other stuff. So there's a plethora of opportunities, even in things that are not production. You don't have to farm. Agri-tech.
Yeah.
Right? It's technology. If you're an engineer, if you're an artist, like there's so many ways I view how to get into agribusiness that perhaps are quite different to what most people just see as agribusiness and thinking of it as just, let me farm. So,
yeah. No, brilliant. So, I mean, you've mentioned that there is a plethora of opportunities with regards to agriculture in Africa. So if we look from the other perspective in terms of those opportunities, how big is the global demand for African agriculture to serve those opportunities from your perspective?
Wow, I think we're going to see more and more of it grow over the next few years. You have a reality around the world where people are starting to look at food shortages. You're starting to see issues with logistics, some of these pipelines, and we have the land. And when I say we have the land, I'm not just talking about the space. When you talk about the richness of African soil, I think it's unlike anywhere else in the world, anywhere. And so it's not just about having the space and the land. It's we really do have the soil. So the quality and the richness, right, of our products is what there's more demand of. And the demand and there's a growing demand for that natural, organic.
Yeah. So, I mean, you've kind of emphasized in terms of there is a demand, and you see that that demand is going to grow globally for natural African produce. So, I guess that demand has led you or given you the ability to export a lot of produce from Africa to the US and Europe. Has exporting been an easy or difficult experience for you?
Difficult.
Okay. Tell us some of the challenges.
The challenges of exporting. Well, the challenges are different depending on the countries. I think that's one of the challenges too, is when you have West Africa as an example, you have Ghana, Togo, Benin, Nigeria,
Yes.
Cameroon. And some of the challenges have to do with logistics. Some of the challenges have to do with security. Some of the challenges just have to do with bureaucracy. And those make it really hard. But it's not impossible again. It really depends on how much work are you willing to put into this. Like you see, nothing comes easy, right? You got to have that grit to be willing to understand the challenges. And I believe that that's the only way you can actually start taking part in fixing those problems. And going back to the diaspora, sometimes we come in with, well, this is how it works here, so it must work this way back home. And that's where people start hitting their heads on the wall because they feel like they're going crazy and it's repetitive or they're not making any progress. You have to really understand the challenges from a ground root perspective in order to start presenting results. There's a whole value chain of it, right, as well.
A value chain of challenges.
So, we can talk about the logistics, just the logistics of product. We can go back into the packaging and storage thing, but the actual transportation of goods, depending on where it's coming from, those could be challenges. Dealing with organization at ports, or really the process of getting these things done. There's quite a number of them. The bureaucracy, again, goes back to maybe some of the systems and the processes, but it's not impossible. And I think that these things will just get better. That's how I view the continent, and that's why I'm invested in it. It's long term. It will get better, but you got to be part of the process of making it better.
100%.
So exporting has its challenges. It can be a good way to do agribusiness. But one of the big things I am realizing is when we talk about exporting, we're often discussing taking it off the African continent to another continent. However, I believe the biggest opportunities is the intra-African trade. And so that's where I'm going to be spending more time.
Yeah, I think definitely AFTA is something that we should all be looking forward to from a international trade, development, social, economic, political, from every angle you can think of. It's something that's definitely a positive and something that we should all be looking forward to and trying to play our own part in making it become a reality as soon as possible. Thank you for that, Shalom. You mentioned in terms of some of the challenges or friction points you've had in terms of your journey of exporting. If we also look from the perspective in terms of working in different African countries, each country has its specific ways of working, its nuances internally, and how it kind of works with the external business community. So from your personal experience, which countries would you say have the most enabling policies for people who want to do business in agriculture, and why?
I'll say there's certain countries that overall are trying to make the ease of doing business in their countries good. And I think most of the countries you go to, agriculture is going to be one of those industries or sectors that they want to promote.
Yes.
Some countries have marketed themselves for the ease of that. So you have places like Rwanda, right? You have places like Ghana that have really spent time to listen sometimes to people like myself.
Yes.
Right? They've spent time to not just market it, but also listen to some of the challenges and try to put solutions in place. So I'll give those two countries maybe my top say. There's other up and coming places, Tanzania,
Yes.
Uganda. Yeah, these are a few of them that I would say I would be looking into. It's not just Nigeria. I know Nigeria is so it's always like Nigeria is Africa, but there's a lot of other places, you know. And I will say that I love my country, right? I love my upbringing. It's influenced everything I do, but it's not the easiest place. And so for entrepreneurs like myself, again, I'm thinking about the team. I'm not just thinking about one player or one position. So we have to diversify the way we do it. And Nigeria hasn't been the easiest place, but I will say that a lot of things have been changing and progressing, let me say. There's been a lot of progress, nonetheless, even if it's not where everybody wants it to be. And you'll hear more of those cries, but there's been some progress in certain industries and in certain ways. So I'll give those countries a shout out.
Oh, fantastic. Oh, thank you for that piece of insight from your personal experience. So you've mentioned some of the countries that you believe or from your experience have enabling environments for doing business in agriculture. You also touched upon some of the challenges. I think one of the things that a lot of people, such as myself, find difficult to understand is that we have so much arable land, we produce so much agricultural produce, but Africa still remains a net importer of food and we still face food security issues. We've touched upon our top line level countries or places that have enabling environments or policies for agriculture. If we kind of dig a bit deeper into that, what type of infrastructure or investment do you think needs to happen to change some of the issues we have with regards to Africa being a net importer of food and kind of eradicating some of the food security issues that we face?
Storage, processing, manufacturing.
I mean, do you have issues with energy supply?
Definitely.
Irrigation, water?
Definitely. You know, those are things that will always help, right? Energy is obviously a big one. I think you can kind of split up countries based on where they are in terms of the energy spectrum.
Yes.
But energy would change a lot of things, not even just the agricultural space, but even from just the agricultural space. I mean, you don't necessarily need electricity to put seeds in the ground, but it can help with ensuring that you do have energy for the processing equipment, for that manufacturing plant. So these are some of the things that you got to put in place. And that's where it starts becoming bureaucratic or political is, okay, well, I can't just go build my own energy plant without the state government coming in. This is where technology, look, things like solar are now real.
Yes.
It's not a fantasy. You have a lot of things that are leapfrogging our continent. People that are in the village, they have cell phones.
Yes.
They will never know what a landline is.
True.
Right? They will never know. And some of these people have 2 cell phones. So there are things and technologies that are coming up in different ways that we can leapfrog some of these problems. Solar is a big part. So yeah, those are just, I guess, a few samples of things that I think could change that. Yeah.
Fantastic. So yeah, obviously you've touched upon what kind of investment needs to happen to change some of the infrastructure to advance or make the process of agriculture in Africa a lot more efficient, effective, and economical. So on a lighter note, if we kind of look back at your time of playing football in the United States, do any of your former teammates, they ever inquire about investing in Africa?
Absolutely.
Now that they know that you're there?
Yeah, it's been an interesting journey. At different stages, I've gotten different responses from people in terms of Africa and people's perception of Africa. I've been, for a lot of people, really their only connection to the continent. And so they see it through the things I tell them or the things I share and show. And so people's perceptions have changed a lot. And that really just comes down to primarily over the years showing from I'm this African immigrant and having comments made about my accent
Yes.
or whatever perception they have of Africa to now, hey, what are the opportunities there? Where can I invest? Or where, is there opportunity for this or all these things? And so absolutely, a lot of not just teammates, people everywhere. I mean, strangers. It's from all parts of the world that now have interest in Africa in different industries as well. So as far as football buddies, yeah, I've had some of my old football buddies and Mexican teammates that are already familiar, for example, with hibiscus, already understand it from that perspective. Now they know, oh, it actually is farmed over there, so it's an easy conversation with some people like that. For others, some of them are looking for the football opportunities in Africa.
Oh, interesting.
Which things that I'll be sharing more of as the year goes on. But integrating football and farming, right?
Oh, wow.
How you can do that, and using farming in the rural areas and other areas as a gateway and a way to give other people, especially youth, opportunities in many other ways, including football. Some people want to be football players and play professionally. And so I've just been finding my way of integrating what I do in farming and football to create opportunities and teach from my experience. So yeah, a lot of people are interested in the opportunities in Africa. I think varying levels of interest. Some people are just interested to hear. Some people are interested to actually actively do something, but there's varying interest. And overall, though, I'm happy with the level of interest and the trajectory that it seems like it's taking seems to be going up. There's a lot more interest. And I think that that's also where people in the diaspora, especially, need to get past just the conversation of it.
Yes.
To understanding find your place on this football field. Everybody cannot move back. Everybody cannot be a farmer. Everybody cannot be an exporter. Everybody cannot be the distributor. It's just, you got to find where you fit.
No, fantastic analogy. I like the way you bring both parts of your life together in terms of football and farming, and it's great to hear that people's perceptions of Africa are changing. As I said before, you're integrating football and farming to prepare the youth and the future. So I guess on that note, where do you see Africa in 5 years' time from an agricultural perspective?
That's a great question. In 5 years' time, I think there'll be no question that I think it'll be a lot more, not that there was any question before, but it will be a lot more known globally that the quality of African foods and the African agriculture is there. And I think that it will still be a young, growing stage, right? And then there'll be a lot more investments in the processing and manufacturing sector of agriculture. That's where I see it in the next 5 years.
Fantastic. I like that vision. Where do you see yourself in Afrivana in 5 years' time?
Being at the forefront of that, being at the forefront of marketing and distributing African superfoods. We're going to be leaders in that space, and leading the marketing, distribution, manufacturing of African superfoods.
I mean, you're doing great things already, so I guess if you maintain that momentum and consistency, there's no reason why you can't achieve that.
Thank you. And yeah, you just got to work to it, have a strategy, and play those games day by day, and close out the season and those type of things. And like I said, I still approach it on a day-to-day basis like a football match.
Yes.
Practice. You gotta still go to practice every day. Everyone sees the players on the field on game day, but they don't see that every day. They wake up in the morning and drive to the stadium for morning workouts, for practice, for physical therapy, watching when you eat, watching when you sleep. Like, there's a lot more to it than just what happens on the field on game day. So Same thing with agriculture. There's a lot that happens off the farm,
Yes.
right? That makes the production on the farm successful. And so that's how we're going to continue approaching it.
Quote of the week.
As people, we often have quotes, mantras, and, as Africans, African proverbs or affirmations that we use to keep us going when times are hard. I'm sure you must have one. Do you have one that you can share with us today?
Okay, maybe I'll give you a couple.
Just a couple.
I have these 6 kind of core principles that I share with people in discussing my journey. And I started this when I wanted to try out to become a professional football player.
Okay.
Again, this was being a Nigerian born and raised immigrant. Football wasn't something that I really saw. So having that goal was just big. It just seemed almost impossible.
Yes.
But these 6 things I still use to this day to kind of go towards these goals. It's 3 Ds and 3 Ps. So the 3 Ds are discipline, dedication, discernment, and then passion, purpose, and persistence. And this is summarized in a phrase that I use. And you'll still see it in content today, or if you go back 10 years. Dreams and ambition. This was like a staple name or brand that I've been able to, dreams and ambition. It summarizes to me, that's I guess a phrase that just continues to be a driver to me. And within dreams and ambition, those 6 principles are what make up dreams and ambition to me. And so dreams and ambition is more than just a phrase to me, it's actually a movement.
Okay.
And I have my blog, my community of people that over the years I've been able to gather and continue to preach dreams and ambition and teach those core principles, because that's what I wrote down, to reach my goals, to become a professional football player. Same thing for business. It was dreams and ambition. And you can have the dreams, but you got to also have the ambition. And that ambition entails a lot of other things: the discipline, the dedication, the discernment, the passion, the purpose, and the persistence.
Beautiful. Very concise.
Thank you.
On that note, as we're coming to the end of the conversation, do you have any closing remarks and final calls to action for people who are listening who might be interested in doing business in Africa, or specifically agriculture in Africa?
Yeah, I've begun to put together a number of resources. I've put together a couple of ebooks. One is called The Exporter's Guide, which gives people sort of a blueprint on how to become successful at exporting. I also put together another one called The Beginner's Guide to Business in Africa, which also just kind of breaks down some of the things we talked about, the risks of doing business there, some of the top countries that I see opportunities in, the untapped opportunities that are on the continent, how to get started simply, how to get started with little money. So I try to put some of these into these concise ebooks, and I'll be doing more of that, releasing more of these books that will be just resources for people to be able to kind of get those ideas and thoughts. And similar to you, I'm going to do a little bit more podcasting.
Brilliant. I look forward to it.
But one of the things I really want people to take away, I'm really passionate about Africans on the continent and in the diaspora. And the one message I want to send to everyone is the continent cannot do without the diaspora, and neither can the diaspora do without the continent. And I think that, in relation to agriculture and international trade, it's important that we get these concepts and these ideas, because we're both the producer and the consumer, and we don't really play a role, a huge role in between. And I think that's where, that would be my call to action to people. If you want to get into agribusiness, look at more than just being the producer or the consumer.
So true. I think that's a beautiful way to close a conversation. I think I'll just leave it there. From being honest, there's not much more I can add. So thank you, Shalom, for being so open and honest with us about your Africa business journey.
Thank you for having me.
No, it's been a pleasure. Thank you a lot. I think you shared some words of wisdom, inspiration, and practical tips for people who want to, explore agriculture in Africa, for people who are looking to potentially move back to Africa. So thank you for sharing your journey on the podcast.
Thank you for having me, and I enjoy sharing it, and whether to inspire or to learn something from it, that's always my goal.
Fantastic. Thank you, and we will speak soon.
Awesome. Thank you.
Thank you to everyone who has listened and stayed tuned to the podcast. If you've enjoyed this episode, please subscribe, share, or tell a friend about it. You can also rate, review us in Apple Podcasts or wherever you download your podcast. Thank you, and see you next week for the Unlocking Africa podcast.